Hello, all. We'll just wait for about a minute before we get started. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and begin, and I'm sure we'll have some other people enter the Zoom room while we are speaking. So, welcome everybody back to our second workshop in this fall 2024 semester, or wherever you are and what you're doing around the world. Today we have our speaker, Justin O'Connor, all the way from the University of South Australia, and which is why we have a special time for our workshop tonight. It's 6 p.m. here on the east coast of the United States, or in the Eastern time zone. So good evening for a lot of people, but also it's nice to be able to open up the workshop to some of our friends across the world who otherwise can't really make that 12 p.m. Eastern time, a little bit difficult. So with that, I will just turn it over to our speaker, Professor Justin O'Connor, and I'll allow you, Justin, to just give your own introduction and to begin, which is we're hearing from Justin today about his very controversially titled book, um, Culture is Not an Industry. So excited to hear.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Great to be here. I'm actually speaking from Melbourne, where I live, which is a big city, about 8 hours drive from Adelaide. So it's yes, it's always a bit of a commute, and I it's just trying to become spring. Well, it is spring, but it's trying its hardest. So we're upside down in all sorts of ways. So yeah, so it's an early morning. Well, 8 a.m. So a good time for me. Hopefully more convenient for you. So yes, well, I'm disappointingly perhaps not Australian. I'm from the UK originally. I've been in Australia since 2008, and I um, I began working a lot in Manchester quite some time ago in the 1990s, and that's when the idea of the cultural industries, which later, as I'll speak about, morphed into the idea of creative industries. This is when the idea of creative cultural industries began, and I won't go into the arcane history of the term. I know it goes back to Horkheimer and Adorno. I'm sure you've all covered that, but it really becomes active in the 1990s. And my book, Culture is Not an Industry, is really, um, really takes a polemical hammer to the whole idea of creative industries. So I wanted to um, start by just evoking the more how would I say it, utopian aspects of the idea of cultural industries or creative industries. And my own personal background was very much in Manchester, in the north of England, in the 1960s, 60s, God, in the 1990s, when actually Manchester was coming off the back of a huge wave in popular culture, popular music, really, that some of you might know. So Joy Division was a big presence there, New Order and the Smiths and all that kind of hacienda stuff. So it was quite a powerful thing. And I was very interested in this, as many other people were, and yet the city itself barely acknowledged these things happening. Certainly not in the 80s, and the city itself was in suffering a lot of industrial decline. It used to be the industrial capital of the world, or one of them, and now it was really down at heel. So putting the two together was an important thing, and that's much of my early writings were about the reinvention of the city, the city not as an industrial space, but as a space of experiment and creation and all those kind of things. And this sheer upsurge of popular culture, which we might talk about in discussions, which Mark Fisher calls it popular modernism, the idea of this very forward-looking, intensely creative, intensely inventive popular culture that seemed especially in the UK under Margaret Thatcher in the 80s and 90s, seemed a ray of hope, possibly resistance, but certainly a ray of hope in that scenario. And so, what the cultural industries idea did was to kind of put some of this together. And so it was a celebration of popular culture, and it explicitly looked to the old, the British cultural studies. But it was also about possibly a new kind of economy. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of what we then called post-Fordism. All this seemed to herald possibilities for small-scale industries, bottom-up, creative, innovative, entrepreneurial, small-scale businesses that seemed to, poised to inherit the earth in a way. Um, and I think this very much fed into the Labour Party, or as they call themselves, New Labour, very much fed into their growing popularity through the latter half of the 1990s, Tony Blair, etc., which, although now uh, many of us look back on the Tony Blair's, the neoliberalization of social democracy. At the time, it seemed like, it's the great way, finally we'll get rid of the conservatives and finally we'll open the future to a different kind of possibility. And creative industries, culture, popular culture was very much part of this narrative of a new kind of UK future opening up. And I think it's important to say that because in 1998, when Labour got in 1997, New Labour, and in 1998 they released a document with lots of tables and statistics, and they called what we had called the cultural industries creative industries. And we were very much enthused by this because finally it was a recognition of this. And so it very much came out of a utopian moment that possibly there was a real time for change here, and the kinds of kind of counterculture, popular culture that had been so important to many people was coming home. Was finally getting a place in the sun, if you like. So my book was very much a kind of a critique of that, a critique of what that creative industries moment meant. And in a way, I probably won't rehearse a lot of those criticisms now. Very at the most basic level, although at the time we thought creative industries, cultural industries, does it matter? I mean, same thing kind of thing. It's certainly become clear since that the introduction of the word creative into that, the replacement of cultural industries by creative industries was a political act, and it basically removed this kind of so it removed culture from the equation, or the values that the word culture brought with it, and kind of tightly screwed it into the innovation agenda. And I talk a lot about that in the book, how a certain kind of, coming out of Silicon Valley, but not just there, a new kind of startup economy, and how creative industries really try to annex itself to that. So very much a new economy kind of thing. It also valorized the creative class, as we know Richard Florida's work. I think he's in Toronto now. Richard Florida's work, where he saw the creative class as the class of the future. And famously, if I'm getting his quote right, as he says, the creative class carries the means of production in their heads. So these were set to inherit the world. because they had their own means of production. They didn't need to work in factories. It was there in their schools. And finally, we see what the statistics did. So it very much emphasized statistics and how big this sector was. But it's quite clear to me that I've looked at so many statistics because people just read the headlines, don't they? But if you get under the bonnet, so to speak, under the hood, maybe, and look at how those statistics produce, and you find that it massively inflated. So um, the key thing that the Labour Party did was to add software. And this, and I have to be clear, this doesn't mean computer games or video games, whatever you want to call them. It's not talking about computer games or anybody involved in the digital aspect of the cultural sector. Software development has its own code, but it contributes about 45% to the employment statistics. And this is it's kind of I'm going to call it O'Connor's constant. Whatever statistics you see, that's 45% are software. And software, well, aren't they creative? Well, yes, they are. That's fine. But they're not the cultural sector. If you're working as a data development person in a bank, you get counted on these as a software developer and get counted in the creative industry statistics. So there's a massive inflation. And when you start to add design, and again, I don't mean graphic design, although that's quite big, but industrial design is often put in there, designing engines and things like that. Marketing and advertising, again, they are cultural and they should be in there somehow. But once you look at the statistics, they account for huge amounts of those employment. So there's all these big statistics being bandied about. They employ 5% of the workforce, 7% in London. They add so much money to GDP, billions and billions. And once you start looking at it, the cultural sector, and by that I mean what we might understand by the arts in its broadest sense, but also the cultural industries, film, TV, um, video games, publishing, all those kind of things, they account for a very, very small amount of these total employment. So in many ways, it's a smoke and mirrors. And the guy who actually invented the idea of creative industries, one of the ministers, Chris Smith, the minister at the time, in conversation with me, in plausible deniability, no doubt, said it was a scam. It was just there to inflate the figures so that they could get a bigger budget from the Treasury, who they had to report it. Anyway, I talk a lot about that in the book. And overall, I wanted to say that what it's done, not just that it's statistically incorrect or it ignores certain aspects, but that it's actually its overall result has been to reduce the value of culture to that of an industrial sector for its economic benefit. And again, the economic aspect of culture is a lot. There's been lots of debates about that over the time, and of course, culture is economically embedded in all sorts of ways. It's a material production. That's fine, and that had been established by the tradition of cultural studies. Here in the US, in the UK, long established the complex interrelations between any forms of culture, even the most esoteric art, to its material base. That's fine. But what was being done here was to reduce its value for public policy to its jobs and growth delivery. And worse still, the way in which the cultural sector itself adopted that as its primary source of advocacy. And this goes all the way up to the top. So by by the early 2010s, UNESCO, which had long been a kind of an oppositional voice, a voice for culture in development globally, had adopted creative economy and was being and promoted this is the key thing. And one of the points I make in the book is how this has failed. You might say, well, we have to, culture's difficult to argue for. Governments don't take it seriously. You've got to use the economic arguments to get to the table, to, make your argument, render unto Caesar, and then you get the money and go and do your art. which is purely pragmatic, and I understand that. And yet, a total strategy, it's been a dismal failure. As we all know, cultural budgets are being cut left, right, and centre. They're being cut throughout Europe, even in the heartlands of France and Germany. The cultural budget is being cut. The new wave of right-wing parties in Europe, they lead on the reduction of cultural budgets and sometimes the abolition of cultural budgets. Maybe we'll come back to them in the discussion. But Australia's got a dismal record of public funding for the arts and many other places as well. And so, um, to me, the test case at a global level was the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals. And UNESCO made a big push to get culture as one of those goals, and it failed. It failed pretty dismally. Um, there's recent, I don't know if you follow these things, but recently in New York there was a big summit of the future. I know it was kind of the news was very much about some of the speeches around Israel and Gaza, etc., etc. But there was actually a summit of the future where Guterres, the Secretary General, tried to reboot the United Nations for a more difficult age. And there's been behind the scenes, there's a lot of maneuvering to try and get culture mentioned in there. So, for instance, at least 15 pages of something like a quarter of the document is about digital, the new digital compact. Culture gets mentioned in two sentences next to sport. And so, in terms of global cultural policy, it's a disaster. Despite all the so-called, the UNESCO pushing for some mention of culture, some mention that culture might be a new goal, development goal, it's disappeared. So there's a real sense that I would say that certainly at the global level, in these kind of arenas, culture as a kind of viable object of public policy is hanging by a thread, which is to say that the whole creative industries argument on its most pragmatic test, get us the funding, has failed. And I think it's also corrupted culture's own self-understanding. So everybody, even the most, committed artists, committed, cultural producers lead with this, oh, well, we contribute XXX dollars to the economy. We contribute XXX employment figures to the economy and all these kind of things. And it's taken all this time to realize that economists, the hard-bitten people you're trying to convince, do not take you seriously because they know the real facts. And the real facts about culture is that it's not a strong economic sector. There are a few growth areas, but in fact, it's not that strong. Anyway, um, to me, one of the indicators of this was also that in terms of a growing radical agenda. So let's say after the GFC, the global financial crisis, around 2007 to 12, that period where the post 1980s neoliberal order was upturned or challenged in its financial heartlands, and we get a decade of quite radical protests. There's been quite a few books about this recently in Europe, in the US, starting with Occupy Wall Street, but going right the way through to Black Lives Matter, in Latin America in different ways, right the way through Hong Kong, across the world. The last decade and a half has been, or certainly up to the pandemic, has been, somebody call it the populist decade, the real upsurges of popular protest on left and, of course, on the right in different ways. And we've got this challenge to heterodox economics. We've got a challenge to the settings of development, growth. We've got the awareness of climate change, all these very kind of radical new ideas within economics, within community economics, within feminist economics, within ecological economics, plus the social and political movements around there. And what struck me was what kind of began, caused me to write the book. What struck me was how culture was no longer part of this sense of a transformative change. It's disappeared. I was very much struck by Kate Raworth's book called Donut Economics. I don't know if you know, it became a bestseller. and she basically she was one of the most high profile of the heterodox economists, and she began to talk about the social foundations. We must make the economy work for us, what's important to humans, to society, not some abstract notion of GDP growth. And she laid out the social foundations. This is the floor below which we cannot live as a decent society. And of course, the um, ecological ceiling. We've got to satisfy human needs within the capabilities of the planet. Great, that's the donut. Nothing about culture in there. And of course, I don't know Kate Raworth personally, but you will imagine she goes to concerts, pop concerts or opera. I don't know. She reads books, she goes to plays, she watches Netflix. No mention of this. And I kept seeing this right across the spectrum. The culture had dropped out of this radical things. Um, by chance, I was reading. I don't know by chance anyway, but I'm reading Habermas's legitimation crisis. Well, Jürgen Habermas, the great German sociologist, um, wrote a book in the I think 74 about the impending crisis, as we know, the crisis of social democracy that led to the kind of 1980s revolution, or counter revolution, if you like. Um, and in that, art and culture, radical art, emerges as one of the key areas, almost like of hope, of transformation. That this is where one of the key fights against the older system, and where the possibilities of transformation can be found. And I think wherever we are now, and I think we're in some kind of uh, certainly transition. Certainly, one system has gone. We don't know if there's what the other system is going to be, or if there will be another system. But in that moment, this moment of radical transformation, art and culture are absent, I would say, certainly in terms of culture's public bodies, its advocacies, the language you hear written about it in terms of policy and politics. Culture's absent from it. And I think that's quite a shocking indictment. So I actually tried to start thinking about how it could be put back in there. And I used a group of what do we call them? Dour political economists from Manchester. Manchester quite a dour city, and the foundational economy collective. So a group of hard-headed political economists and historians who, over the last decade and a half, have tried to rethink economics, not in any deep theoretical way, but in a historical way, as how do we satisfy the basic social needs? How do we understand the social foundations upon which we have to start organizing our social and political life? Um, and they identify what they call the social foundations, which is the material infrastructure, the fiber optics, the communications, the transport, basic access to housing, basic access to water, to electricity, all those kind of things. And then, of course, what they call the providential foundations, the social services, education, health, basic public administration. These are the things that are the infrastructure, if you like. I'll come back to that word maybe later, but the foundations of social life, material and social foundations. They then took point to another area, which they call, the local, small scale local area. They call it the everyday economy of, I don't know, restaurants, cafes, little travel agents, small scale hairdressers, people who fix cars, that kind of thing. Um, and then on top of that is what, the fully transactional, highly commercial, fully capitalist economy, if you like. And just breaking those down into employment figures, that they found it in the UK as a whole, something like 60% of the population were employed in these social foundations and in this everyday economy. And that includes London. So London, of course, is a very, very big, economically powerful city. But when you go to somewhere like Wales, those proportions drop to something like, rise to about 70%. So we talk about GDPs, we talk about fast growth and high growth, we talk about inward investment, and cutting edge technologies. But in fact, 70% of the population in Wales in this case is employed in basic the satisfaction of basic social needs, both material and if you like social, and these small scale local economies. And we did a replica of this in Australia and it found very similar kind of figures. So it was part of this turning away of attention to how does the economy actually work? How is livability achieved? In London, for instance, they found that disposable income was almost two times that of Wales. And yet, when you looked at how a household, what money they had to spend, of course, many people in Wales were better off because they weren't commuting. They weren't paying ridiculous rents. They weren't paying for massively expensive childcare because, all these kind of costs. So they began to look at livability. They looked at what they call the zonal economy, different kinds of ways, different ways of breaking the economy, understanding that the economy is different, is organized differently, and it's not all this highly transactional, cutting edge kind of stuff. And what struck me, there was a little anecdote in there about a place in Wales, how the local economic development person was talking about a small, kind of creative workspace, and there's like six people on Apple Macs there, typing away and drinking single origin coffees. Uh, Down the road, there was a big shed employing 500 people making kind of crappy furniture, furniture that people could afford. This was totally ignored. It was the five people of six people with their Apple Macs. This was the future. This kind of skewed concept, really struck me. And in the book, and I won't explain it in detail too much, I tried to look at, well, if we looked at culture in this way as a part of the foundational economy, what would we see? We would see that most of it's about most of it's about basic access to local social and cultural infrastructure, parks, libraries, schools, small scale venues, etc. Um, a lot of it's this everyday economy. It's the market. It's a private sector in that way, but they're small businesses. It's gift economies. It's hand to mouth stuff. All this that you get a few grants maybe from the government, often not through a cultural budget, but it's a way of kind of you make ends meet. And then on top of that, of course, you've got the large scale transactional economy. And when I began to look at that, I realized you could use that as an important heuristic to look at culture in a local area, for instance, because creative economy thinking, you get some big accountancy firm to come in and count employment, to count GV, value added and how many jobs created, blah, 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 blah. But look at it from this lens. Look at what is there provided by the state, or local state, or in whatever form, access to basic cultural and social infrastructure. Often there's a big overlap. Who's providing the kind of educated, the people running the classes or working in the library? Who's providing them? Who's educated them? Well, usually it's the state. The small scale sector, again, they're seen by creative industry people as a kind of a startup economies, aren't they? We're all entrepreneurial. Well, maybe they better be seen as co-ops, or the rise of new municipalism. This idea of local economies run yes, it's private sector. People are going to make money, but at the same time, it's a lot of it's about gift economy, it's about collaboration, it's about sharing, it's about different ways of organizing the economy to suit the local needs, not to achieve a massive expansion. So different ways of looking at that economy. And also what struck me was the way in which the transactional economy, the highly commercial, big scale, the big cinema chains, but also, streaming services, Spotify or Netflix, etc., those kind of things. A ticket machine, Ticketex is a big thing in Australia at the moment, a huge monopoly. So we've got this very commercial sector on the top, which we've long had in, going right back to Hollywood and maybe before at the end of the 19th century. We've got this huge commercial sector. But to my mind, this was growing in importance. And maybe we'll talk about that in the discussion. So I wanted to really try and think, well, how can we think of an approach to culture that acknowledges this difference? And so I began. That's what I write about. I suppose culture is part of the social foundations that we need to reorganize or repurpose our advocacy, if you like, our self-understanding to make the argument that culture, and we can define what that means perhaps, but art and culture, I call it, is not an industry, but it's part of the social foundations. It's part of the what it is to fully participate in society, and that's why it's a human right, going back to the the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, the right to fully participate in art and culture, the cultural life of societies. So that it's a human right, and in order to that for that right to be affected, you need to provide the basic cultural infrastructure. Um, and the purpose of this is not to create jobs. I mean, great, if you create a job, fine, great. But the purpose is to provide culture because without it, um, we're not living in a recognizably human society. It's something that's really crucial to how we live locally, and it's also crucial to how we understand citizenship and participation. And so it's these kind of arguments that I wanted to make in the book, and that it's actually difficult now. After it was always difficult once, certainly from the 1980s, but since culture has been deemed to be an industry, be a creative industry, and we've all got to approach it in those kind of terms, it's increasingly difficult to make the argument, no, that culture is an object of public policy alongside health, education, but access to houses, access to basic key infrastructure. And we have to start making those arguments like that. Um, so that's me half an hour up. So I'll leave it there, and maybe we can pull some other things out in the questioning. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I'll start with a couple questions, but I'd like to just invite everybody to put their questions in the chat, and I'll ask and I'll moderate, and then please also feel free to raise your hand, and I will call on you. So I'd like to start with a pretty big, complicated, maybe very challenging question, and I obviously have some theories to what the answer is, but so this is the Keynes idea that as production technology becomes more efficient, and decades and decades ago, Keynes talked about how as production technology gets more efficient, people will have to work less, will have more time for leisure, and he can imagine a world where there is more engagement with culture. So your narrative, the beginning of what you spoke about, your narrative is basically saying the opposite has happened. We're sort of seeing culture on a global policy scale declining in importance, especially in some of our, globally, I think, especially in the United States, right, where we see these right-wing forces not having any relevance whatsoever to culture in the policy agenda. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what happened? How did we get here instead of where Keynes and other economists thought we were going to be at this point?
Well, I think Keynes was right in that. Yes, we will have to some extent extended leisure time, and we will have space to engage in art and culture to some extent, although that's hedged around in different ways. But to some extent, that's true. But however, what he didn't realize was that it would be a privatized sector. And so, looking at the large scale, what's happened in the last 40 years is the idea of culture has been uh, it's been redefined at the highest level, or I should say the highest level, redefined within treasuries, within the heart of the of government, as a consumer good. Uh, there is no justification whatsoever in current government thinking for the subsidy of culture if it can be produced privately. And so and it took me some time to understand where this was coming from. So for if you, for most governments, um, for or let's say for many governments, especially in the economic heart of that government, culture is a private leisure good. It's something between you and your credit card. If you like it,
Mm,
that, and that's its value, and you pay for it. And that it's only in, as in market failure circumstances. So maybe poor people need some access. Maybe certain things like opera that we might value, so that or libraries can't be paid for, and so we need to do that. But in general, that um, culture is a private, subjective value that's expressed by your act of purchase or whatever attendance, and that cultural value as a whole is the aggregation of all these individual choices. The state has no right, has no grounds, it has no capacity to judge whether this is good or bad. It can only respond to that. As I say, except in these certain kind of market failure areas. And that's 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 what you get if anybody, if you ever go and talk to the politicians. I don't mean cultural policy people, but cultural politicians. That's what you more or less get at the limits. So, and it's also underpins a lot of the creative industries argument in the 90s, which is, all goods are. It's not just we have more leisure time to consume culture, but the goods we do consume are about experiences or about aesthetics. They're about, you buy a fridge not because of how functional it is, but how it looks. And, this was a major factor behind the growth of creative economies. The economy was being culturalized, that, we were now buying experiences, this whole experience economy nonsense. We were buying experiences and all this kind of thing. So in many ways, these were classic tropes of what we might call cultural forms of engaging in art and culture, but they were deemed to be a new private sector thing. So it's been privatized
and do you think
basically.
so? Are you saying that the push of the creative industries has been I'm sorry, so the shift from public to private, is that a byproduct from the push for recognizing the creative industries?
No, I think creative industries came after. Um, that
Uh,
that that the privatization of culture began in the 1980s. So in the this was in the 1980s. If you remember, well, I won't get into the new world, but basically what happened in the 1980s, the whole global deregulation of various uh, communications possibilities, satellites, fiber optics, all those kind of things. There was a massive process of deregulation. And for the first time, the cultural sector, meaning, television mostly, but also other forms of publication, became big business. So I mean we often see the 1980s, that's certainly in the UK and in Europe, as a kind of urban radicalism, but in fact at a higher level, the 1980s was a process whereby certainly global communications and many communication systems within the nation state were increasingly privatized, and becoming absorbed into larger businesses. So I think we've got a deeper kind of privatization of the communication sphere, which gradually, as technology went on, that became content. So you've got that happening, but I think it's also a political choice, that part of the neoliberal revolution, part of it's the core ideology is that states cannot decide what is good for people. And that's what a cultural policy does ultimately. We're saying this is somehow to be valued in some way. But states, according to neoliberal economics, cannot make that choice. They can only respond to the aggregated choices of individual consumers. The individual is the only person that can determine their own good. And if that can if that can be made an economic transaction, the better, because that's a real expression. None of this, don't we have the contingent value and all these kind of quasi market things? No, this is somebody put the hand in the pocket and slapped $20 on the table. That means they value it that much. And so, in some ways, it's core neoliberal economics, even neoclassical economics. At the same time, of course, it is a political thing. The cultural sphere, and I think this goes way back, but the cultural sphere was always problematic for a certain kind of right wing view of this polity. It used to be conservative, I would say. It used to be part of opera used to be seen as a right wing thing. High culture was often could be as right wing as it. Um, but it's very much, I think, that um, culture was seen as problematic by antithetical to a neoliberal revolution. So I think it's a very deliberate move that to privatize culture, to move it away from the public sector and kind of decisions of government into the private sector. I think that was it was both economically ideological, if you like, but also politically ideological.
I'll go to Michael's question in the chat. So he asks you, what do you think of creative placemaking as a grassroots participatory approach to cultural production in cities, as opposed to a top-down approach in which culture is forced?
Um, well, it just depends what we mean. I do begin to sniff when I hear creative placemaking, because actually often they are government programs, aren't they? Whether local or state government. I really don't think we should oppose the two. This top down, bottom up. Um, I think it's we've been forced into a false binary here. I think there are certain aspects of any participation in culture that do depend on some kind of state subsidy payment. And I mean here, the various institutions of training, of production, educational institutions, training institutions, preservation, whether that's, galleries or performing arts centres or whatever. There's a whole range of things, libraries, all these things depend on quite, I think, high levels of state investment. I would call them public goods. They are goods provided kind of collectively, and it's upon the basis of that that we can then start making our own individual and communal choices. So I think bottom up, active participation in the making of culture is great. Of course it is. It's part of, I can't think of a viable cultural policy that wouldn't try and foreground that. But I don't think that should be counterposed to them up there telling us what to like. I think that there's a complementarity there. I think the real problem is the more broad extraction of money, resources from the system as a whole that's a problem. Whether that's the big places, the soft, the large cultural institutions, or whether it's a small level cultural funding. Both of those are seeing resources being extracted from them. So that I think it is good. Of course, it's good to have that kind of conflict between the bottom up and top down. But I don't think it should be seen as structural. I think they both have to coexist.
I'll go to Carol. You have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm wondering why we have to say that culture is not an industry at the same time that we recognize that culture is everyday and quotidian. I mean, I see the like rhetorical or polemical value of doing that, but in terms of actually sort of what's going on in the arts and culture, just for example, we know that many people who work in the arts and cultural workforce do that using inherited or household wealth. And that wealth comes from other parts of the economy, and the cultural economy would not sustain itself without those resources coming in sort of on the down low. But also, even to see the effectiveness of, in the United States, the effectiveness of arguments being made about the cultural workforce during COVID and the requirement for extra public funds that was very successful in the performing arts and also in institutions of higher learning and pretty much all across the cultural sector, enormous subsidy was streamed in. And that all was built on the foundation of understanding the economic dimensions or the economic relevance of the arts and culture. So I'm just wondering if it's necessary to say that this is either or instead of both, and that both is actually tied together and mutually sustaining of one another. And just finally to say, except when it isn't, of course, there is this important dimension that you just touched on in your last comment of politics within the cultural sector. And we do have institutions that would say, like, yes, it's fine if money goes to those neighborhood level or everyday activities, but as only if we get ours first, because we are the ones who are really culture, right? And not you, like, so us first. So, one question about the way the economy is tied together, the cultural economy with other aspects of the economy. And the second question about how politics might influence our thinking about this, politics within the cultural sector.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, of course, culture is, well, first of all, culture is an economy. It's it deals, it involves the circulation of resources, scarce resources. If you want to do a basic economic thing. So of course it's economy, and of course it has weight. It's differently distributed, but it has a certain kind of economic weight. But then so does education, and then so does health. Actually, I'm very conscious now of making these arguments to it within the US. Virtually. I don't know if most of it from the US, but anyway, um, because actually in Australia, for instance, I would make the argument that I would say this. I would say, look, health is an economy. It employs millions of people, far more than culture does. In fact, as an object of government spending, it's far higher than that. It has a real weight. The arrival of a hospital or a university in a small town is a it's an economic event. But then I would say, well, but would you put a hospital somewhere just to create jobs? Or would you put a university somewhere just to create jobs? The answer, disturbingly now, more and more is probably yes. I don't know. But in a way, it seems like some category error there. That the object of health, creating, health infrastructure or health institutions is to provide for the health of the 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 population in some ways, or the education of that population. And but so approaching culture in the same way. Of course, culture has a certain economic weight. And if somebody said, "Oh, hello, can I relocate my film production studio to your locality?" You'd say, "Great." You know, who wouldn't want that? But the idea then that cultural policy, the decisions around culture, its value in terms of public policy is its economic weight, seems to me a very bizarre one, really, because there are things that are far more profitable than culture. And in many ways, culture is a very unproductive sector. There's certain, as you know, there are certain areas that are quite productive because the more you can do digital reproduction, the better. But many aspects of culture are very unproductive. They're very low paid, etc. Um, you know, so it's the economic argument only goes so far. You in Australia during the pandemic, actually similar things came up where the economic relevance of the sector was being promoted, and the government still didn't provide adequate pandemic relief, and it explicitly ruled out higher education from any pandemic relief. That they were particular political decisions, but you know, in the UK again, the similar arguments were made, and the answer to well, the guy who eventually became prime minister, Rishi Sunak, said, "Well, yeah, go and retrain, go and get a proper job." You know, if you roll out the economic arguments, once you go beyond, there are certain economic ways, but if you start making the argument that these are economically valuable, then there are other things that are more valuable. There are other jobs that are more productive, that do earn higher wages. And I know the statistics in Australia and the UK is that although there's some very high earners in the cultural sector, as we know, the majority all earn very, very low wages. They're very precarious. They live hand to mouth. They don't have maternity leave. They don't have vacation leave. You know, there is a big problem with work in the sector. And we know that the reason why many of them work in that sector is because they want to do it. They're not working because of, for wages. They are working for wages, but, they're not working for the big bucks because they're not getting the big bucks. So, as I say, the economic argument, the economic weight of the sector, of course, is to be taken into account. But it cannot be the lead for this is why you should give us money or you should invest in us. It cannot be that lead because there are many other contenders for that money, government money, that are more profitable, basically. And the politics of it, just very briefly. I mean, because I don't know the details of it. Of course, that once you start taking money out of the system, then it's like crabs in a bucket. Everybody's crawling all over each other. We've got big institutions. Yes, we need our core thing because if we don't get our big cut, our stage sets won't be workable, etc., etc. There's a whole kind of politics of of a shrinking pot of public money that's it's not very nice to see. But pan back a bit, and what we're looking at is peanuts. Artists are arguing over $5,000. Oh, we've got pages and pages of application for $3,000 public funding for some art project. You go somewhere else. I mean, sorry, it's too ridiculous to go straight. But look at the money sloshing around in defense or, anything to do with high-tech innovation. Millions and millions and millions and millions and millions. So in the big picture, art's dealing in peanuts. And I think we should look at the big picture of why are we dealing with peanuts? Why, if it's such an important sector, why we think it's an important sector, why are we dealing in peanuts? And so.
Trevor.
Hi. First of all, I've really enjoyed the conversation so far. Thank you very much. My question is actually a follow-up on what you were just talking about. So we've been speaking so far about really kind of traditional economic things, job rates, economic growth. do you think that the future of advocacy for the cultural sector is going to still be kind of fundamentally utilitarian, just a different sort of value, or do you think it's going to move more towards intrinsic value of the cultural sector? As an example, here in the United States in the early 2000s, we had this groundswell after educational reform of, oh, the arts are really good for education, so we should invest in the arts because they're going to raise test scores and do all these other ancillary things, which has kind of worked out and kind of not. So I'm curious if you think it's just going to be a different form of benefit, or if there will be kind of a more fundamental shift in how we think about and advocate for the sector.
Yeah, I think that shift has certainly happened, and it's been around for some time. Um, the whole what is it? Listening to Mozart makes you good at maths kind of stuff, or playing classical music at subway stations stops graffiti. I don't know. There's some kind of crass ends of it, but also more generally the well-being agenda. So a lot of artists or cultural sectors could say talking about how this adds to well-being, and well-being is not always, and part of that agenda I would go with, but a lot of goes to health outcomes in quite instrumental ways. Does it stop, suicide? Does it, patient recovery? But also in the UK, they had what they call social prescribing. So doctors were looking at art therapy as a way of getting over things. Not none of these are bad. If playing a playing looking at some art stops suicide, I'm great, fantastic. But there is that instrumentalization of its social benefits. Social cohesion is another one, and I do think we have to be clear as to what the real benefit of culture is, and it actually nowadays sounds very esoteric, and it. I would say two things. First of all, uh, some kind of um, expression or shared expression around the what we would call it, sensory knowledge. Aesthetics refers to the senses, around movement, image, a certain kind of metaphorical text, around sounds, a certain kind of highly symbolic metaphorical way of being in the world is coterminous with human existence. It's there right at the, well, even before. I said this to a seminar a few months ago, and somebody said, what about Neanderthals? Well, yeah, okay, but it's there. It's part, we in Australia, we have recorded culture going back 60,000 years, and there 60,000 years ago, there are carvings on rocks, just like there were in southern France, etc. So it's coterminous with human existence, that kind of symbolic expression. And I think it's become more and more important in the contemporary world, as we've known, I think, since the end of the 18th century, although, that comes with other things, other baggage. But basically, it's a form of knowledge about the world that's not a kind of abstract rational, put it schematically. It's a form of knowledge about the world without which we we're not living in a human world. And this is, whether that's sounds, whether that's text, whether that's, a kind of a sort of heightened text, whether that's rhythm and movement at any level. I'm not talking about the highest level or the lowest level, at all of those levels. That is part of what it is, what humans do. And it's to see that as moved entirely into a consumer economy, and not worthy of public funding or only at the margins. I think it's really highly problematic, and I think we have to start saying some those kind of things, which is the access to the ability to make and fully participate in culture is a human right, and with rights we need the resources, and those resources include a basic cultural infrastructure. It means some kind of education, whether at school or whether in other kind of institutions. It means access to spaces, whatever those spaces are, digital or real, access to spaces where culture could be produced and shared. And it means that we should have social and cultural infrastructure in which communities can engage in cultural production and shared cultural practice together. These are just, I think, they were always quite basic demands, but now we're having to make these in different ways. So I think we need to move back from the instrumental and say these are the intrinsic qualities of culture, and they provide basically the basis of citizenship. It's part of what our citizenship is, to fully autonomous citizens in a democratic society, and culture is part of that mix.
We're at the hour, but I have such a good question from Carlos that I just want to ask you, and maybe you could give us, one or two sentence response. It is a big one, but he says, what do you think is the problem that most people cannot integrate culture into their lives, except for, he calls it popular culture, which I think is culture too. But I mean, is this intuition that says that culture is important, but for some reason the average person does not understand that or does not perceive it. Why? So do you think it's true? And if you do think it's true, what do you think the problem is?
Well, I'm not sure if I do think it's true. Uh, I agree. Popular culture is culture. I mean, what are we watching? Whether we're watching, soap operas or films made for Netflix these days, or whether we're listening to, we've got Spotify in our ears, we've got, we absolutely engaged in narratives and stories, whether seen on screen or whether we read them or read them in the newspapers these days. Show me the person who doesn't engage in some form of culture in this sense, some kind of music, who doesn't watch any stories, shows, fiction, if you like, who doesn't have pot ornaments on the shelves at home or whatever. There are very few people who do that. So that's that. I think it's a universal thing. And my own background in the 80s, what I said right at the beginning about the upsurge of absolutely radically, innovative, if that's the word, culture in the 1980s in terms of British popular music. Bit later on, I was out of it by then, but the early 2000s in, UK grime, for instance, a massive explosion of black culture that's quite stunning in what it produced. That's people. They're just in council houses. They're in, the projects. They're, people want to produce culture, and I think the problem is what's given to them, how it's provided, what kind of help and education they get in be able to do that. I read so many stories about UK grime, as I was saying, early 2000s black music in London, and it's, oh, a music teacher at school showed me how to do this, one little thing like that, or I had a friend who got into a community radio. These kind of things, they are there, and everybody wants them. Not everybody will be professionals or will consider it main part of their life, but nobody does. Very few people do not engage in any form of culture. And in fact, if we met somebody like that, we'd think they were a bit weird, wouldn't we? Almost unhuman, So I think that's where we are. The question is, who's providing that? What are the choices? What are the possibilities to actually go deeper into that, if they so want?
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Justin. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think everyone on the call has as well. So thank you so much for joining us and for
Thank
telling
you.
us about your book. And I put a link for Justin's website in the chat if people are interested in understanding more about the book and when it comes out. Otherwise, please do join us at our regular time in a couple of weeks. We'll have Dave O'Brien from the University of Manchester and Catherine Brown talking a little bit about their work in our new book, Innovating Institutions and Inequities in the Arts. So thank you again, and I hope to see you all in just a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.